Day to everyone participating in this Conversations on Canada webinar featuring Dr. Deborah Thompson. I'm Amy Southerden, Assistant Director at the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, and delighted to welcome you to the third session of the virtual Conversations on Canada series. The Conversations on Canada webinar series is organized by the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York College at Plattsburgh, a U.S. Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center on Canada, with additional support from the Quebec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie. Developed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Conversations on Canada series addresses current issues central to a fuller understanding of Canadian society. Thank you for your time and interest to be here with us today. Most importantly, we hope you are doing well. Our audience includes participants from the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We especially appreciate participation from SUNY Plattsburgh students, faculty, staff, and alumni, business people of our New York State, North Country region and beyond, as well as scholarly members of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States. While we are in a virtual webinar environment, in terms of housekeeping, we welcome you to utilize the chat with any comments you would like to share. And if you have any questions you would like to submit, please note the Q&A box on your screen. Again, please submit any questions specifically in the Q&A box. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Christopher Kirky, Director of the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York College at Plattsburgh, and President of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States, who is moderating this session.
Thank you, Amy, very much. It's my pleasure to join you this afternoon and to be able to introduce Deborah Thompson, a good friend and colleague who will be speaking to us momentarily. As Amy pointed out, this is our third conversation on Canada this semester. It's been under current pandemic conditions, it's been a refreshingly wonderful and well-attended and series of scholarly talks. So we are delighted that Deb has joined us today. She's an associate professor at McGill University in the Department of Political Science. She's a leading scholar on the comparative politics of race. She has a variety of teaching interests that include the dynamics of racial inequality in democratic societies. Her Cambridge University 2016 book, The Schematic State, Race, Transnationalism, and the Politics of the Census, is a really fine work of scholarship, is a simple way to put it, because it's decidedly comparative. The scope, the arc that she covers in her research is original, it's fresh, and she's currently, I want you to know, writing a book on the global rise of Black Lives Matter at the present time. Today's talk is entitled The Black Experience in Canada, Race, the State, and Social Inequality. With no further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Thompson. Deb, please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you all for being here virtually, wherever you are. Thanks as well to Chris and Amy for hosting me virtually. It's a pleasure to be in my office coming to you. So as with so many things, I gave the title for this talk before I wrote it. And so this is not exactly on Blackness in Canada. It's more like on Blackness in Canada and the US and moving between those places and what we learn as we move. But I think it's timely and I hope you enjoy it. This is part of a new book project that I'm working on. It's a book actually that's meant for a general audience. And I've never written a trade book before. So I hope that you all will have some good feedback for me. And I really look forward to our short discussion at the end of the talk. Okay, here we go. The day after Donald Trump was elected, the 45th president of the United States, my father said to me, "You know, Deborah, your daughter was the first Thompson born in America since Cornelius Thompson escaped slavery. It's been over 150 years, and some days I think we came back too soon. My father was born and spent most of his childhood in Shrewsbury, Ontario. It's a tiny town about 50 miles east of Detroit on the shores of Lake Erie. It and other neighboring towns like Buxton and Dresden were among the last stops on the Underground Railroad. In 1850, the US Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act as part of a series of political compromises made between the South, the Southern and enslaving states, and the free Northern states. The legislation required that officials arrest people who were suspected of being runaway slaves based on little or no evidence, and they penalized any official who didn't comply. Any person found aiding a runaway slave by providing food or shelter was liable to 6 months in prison and a $1,000 fine. Monetary awards were offered to anyone who captured any fugitive slave. Those suspected of being runaway slaves were not eligible for a trial and couldn't testify on their own behalf or defend themselves against any accusations. The result was the legalization of a national program of mass kidnapping of free Blacks across the United States. But the Fugitive Slave Act didn't extend to Canada, and to Canada, thousands fled, including my grandfather's grandfather, Cornelius Thompson. Most of the people that escaped to Canada went back to the United States after the end of the Civil War to find the loved ones left behind, stolen from them along the way, or lost as they traveled north. But generations of those descended from enslaved Black Americans stayed in southwestern Ontario, including my father's family. Because the communities were small and rural and segregated, my kin have the most interesting way of speaking. Southern intonations inflicted with Canadian accents. My father says theater and pronounces the WH in white. He talks in the same riddles that characterize barbershop talk in African-American cultures and communities. He says things like, well, Deborah, you know, hindsight is 20/20 because any fool can turn around and look behind him. But he is also staunchly, fiercely, proudly Canadian, and his accent appears plainly in words like a boat and sorry. Dad doesn't know where Cornelius escaped from. He thought he heard someone talking about West Virginia or Alabama once. But Deborah, he said, you're looking for ghosts. You're looking for evidence left behind by people who were trying to hide and whose lives depended on how well and for how long they could do it. So many of our stories are ghost stories. How could they not be? African descended peoples in the Americas are connected by the horrors of the Middle Passage, the point during the triangular route of the transatlantic slave trade when Africans were violently kidnapped from their traditional territories, commodified as objects, and forcibly transported to the New World, and then sold as property. So, too, the deep of the Atlantic holds a place in our collective memory. There's blood in the water. It is the fathoms of the dead. Historians still debate how many millions of people died on the commercial altar of the transatlantic slave trade. At least 2 million people perished during the voyage across the Atlantic, but as many as 60 million likely died in wars of capture, the death march to the African coastline, or in the seasoning camps in the Caribbean. In the devastatingly insightful A Map to the Door of No Return, Dion Brand reimagines the gravity of the Door of No Return, now an imaginary memorial off the coast of Senegal that marks the point of departure where African captives were forced across the Middle Passage. The door casts a haunting spell on personal and collective consciousness in the diaspora, she writes. Black experience in any modern city or town in the Americas is a haunting. One enters a room and history follows. One enters a room and history precedes. History is already seated at the chair in the empty room when one arrives. Where one stands in a society seems always related to this historical experience. When I decided to move to the United States nearly a decade ago, I thought the ghosts of my ancestors would welcome me home. I felt like I was returning to the land of my ancestors' birth, the country that they built. I felt like I was returning to the places where they prayed, where they sweated and toiled and tortured and resisted and fought and wept as their children were stolen and sold and were traumatized as they were raped for profit and murdered for sport. The country where they died, the places they still haunt. They escaped, and I returned to lay claim to the opportunities and the humanity they were refused. In some ways, I am, as the saying goes, my ancestors' wildest dreams. At least that's what I thought back then. And I now know better than to eagerly or easily accept linear narratives of racial progress, especially any in which I'm some kind of bringer of racial tolerance. The idea that we as a society are shifting from the explicit, exploitative, violent racism of the past to some kind of post-racial society in the foreseeable future is overly simplistic and purposefully misleading. Maybe that's why the lie is so compelling. If we're somehow magically moving towards a future where race doesn't matter, it means we don't actually have to do anything. Time will just do the work for us. It's not that greater progress hasn't been made towards a more sustainable world of racial equality. Some certainly has. Remember this? On the crisp evening of November 4th, 2008, I booked the back room at what was then the Fox and Feather on Spadina Road, just south of Bloor in downtown Toronto. When CNN announced that Barack Obama had won the presidency, over 100 of us spilled onto the street, cheering, chanting, screaming. Cars honked their horns in celebration, and strangers walked by and high-fived anyone they could see. Why would a bunch of Canadian grad students revel in the election of the first Black president of the United States? We weren't alone in the streets of Toronto or anywhere else in the world that night. It was a victory of global proportions. It was a signal that all things were possible, maybe even a Black Prime Minister of Canada one day. It was a lifetime ago. Racial progress has never been inevitable. It's the outcome of struggle, sometimes the ultimate sacrifice of thousands. We should not make our children memorialize Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech without also telling them that he was murdered by white supremacists, leaving his 4 children fatherless. Instead of a Black prime minister, we have a prime minister forced to apologize, at first half-heartedly, for wearing blackface. We live, as Saidiya Hartman once wrote, in the afterlives of slavery still. More than 400 years after the beginning of chattel slavery in British North America, more than 150 years after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution ended racial bondage and granted Black people the rights of citizenship, Black lives continue to be put in peril by a centuries-old racial calculus. The formerly enslaved were promised 40 acres and a mule at the end of the Civil War. Instead, they and their descendants were given morphing forms of state-sanctioned racial domination, convict leasing, exploitative sharecropping arrangements, Jim Crow, lynch mobs, the prohibition of access to mechanisms of intergenerational wealth like higher education, bank loans, and home ownership, redlining, the assassination or forced exile of an entire generation of Black leadership, de facto discrimination, institutionalized racism, the system of mass incarceration, and no choice but to share a country with people who refuse to acknowledge the irreparable damage of these structures. And so, the struggle for citizenship, not just citizenship on paper, but the intractable, irreversible political, social, and economic inclusion into the polity, has been the defining characteristic of African-American social and political life for centuries. The most recent iteration of this struggle is Black Lives Matter. In early 2020, I was teaching a class called Black Lives Matter and American Democracy at the University of Oregon. And in those early days of 2020, I had begun to wonder if I should be teaching about Black Lives Matter in the past tense. 5 years after Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson shot and killed Michael Brown, what was really different? Black Lives Matter activists throughout the US were still doing the on-the-ground work, but the public's attention had waned. It wasn't because the police had suddenly stopped killing Black people. In September 2018, for example, 26-year-old Botham Jean was shot in his own apartment by an off-duty police officer. She claimed that she mistook his apartment for her own, a floor below. But shootings like these, as racist and as preventable as they were still just one injustice in an avalanche of bad news in those early days of 2020. The Trump administration made a daily habit of political assaults on the impoverished, the undocumented, the disenfranchised, and the vulnerable. The president was impeached in December 2019, and it didn't matter. We still talked about politics. We talked about politics every day, but it was hard on the soul to be outraged all the time. The anger was so overwhelming, so all-consuming that we couldn't help but become desensitized to the ongoing tragedies. Despair breeds indifference. Then, during the last week of my course, COVID-19 hit home. In an instant, the campus became a ghost town. Oregon Governor Kate Brown declared all K-12 schools be closed from March 16th to March 31st, and they never reopened. Working parents scrambled to figure out how to work full-time and provide care for their children. Businesses shut down, the economy fell off a cliff. The governor issued a shelter-in-place order. Congress scrambled to put emergency funding in place for the 30 million unemployment claims filed between March and April. If you listened hard enough, you could hear the hum of the phrase, flatten the curve, flatten the curve, flatten the curve, anywhere you went. Horror stories started to emerge from New York City, the early epicenter of the pandemic. March was the longest month in human history, and April wasn't much better. And then, on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department. The last moments of his life spent being slowly tortured to death as a police officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 45 seconds were recorded by bystanders. The video went viral. Did you know that George Floyd started to cry when he saw the police coming? Did you know that one of the police officers pulled his gun within 15 seconds of encountering Floyd? Did you know that George Floyd begged officers not to kill him? Did you know that even as he was being tortured, he called the officers sir and told them that he couldn't breathe at least 25 times? Floyd's murder followed on the heels of 2 other high-profile murders, shocking, unjustifiable killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. In New York Central Park, a white woman called the police when birdwatcher Christian Cooper asked her to restrain her dog. Her fake, manipulative hysterics went viral and added a sense of liberal middle-class indignation to the emerging unrest. Pundits connected the dots between Christian Cooper and George Floyd, how easily one could have become the other. It added to a growing understanding about how exhausting, how unfair, how disproportionate, how arbitrary these dangers are for Black people, how a chance encounter with a white woman who's unafraid to weaponize her privilege could so easily end a life. Minneapolis exploded. Research in sociology demonstrates that the police tend to be more repressive and violent during protests when those protests are in fact against police brutality. This was no exception, except that some of the protesters being beaten and arrested, tear gassed, and pepper sprayed were white. It was all recorded and posted online. The embers spread to every major American city and then around the world. On June 6, 2020, the peak of the protests, 500,000 people turned out in over 500 cities across the United States. The protests were bigger, more diverse, and lasted for longer than any form of collective action we've ever seen. There was also an incredible shift in public opinion. According to one poll, support for Black Lives Matter increased as much in 2 weeks following George Floyd's murder as it had over the previous 2 years. Left-leaning politicians tried to ride the wave, silently kneeling for staged photos at protests and in the halls of power, completely oblivious to their hypocritical opportunism. The demands made by protesters were not new, but they were gaining more traction than they ever had before. Many echoed the call to defund the police. Concessions were won in key battlegrounds, including Minneapolis, where the city council pledged to dismantle the police department. Confederate monuments were toppled. Seattle removed the police presence from its public schools. Cops, the worst show on television, was canceled. Police reform bills were introduced in at least 20 state legislatures and the House of Representatives. The struggle was resurrected. Change seemed, for that most fleeting of moments, possible. And that's when I left. After spending a quarter of my life in the US, at exactly the same moment when COVID-19 caused economic chaos and mass uprisings against racial injustice rocked cities around the world, I fled, as did my ancestors before me, to Canada. The timing was curious, but a coincidence. A plan of return 2 years in the making was already in motion. With my American partner, our 2 children under 5, and a rescue mutt named the Artful Dodger that my partner had to drive from Oregon to Montreal because he can't fly on a plane, he will die, decided to begin this cross-continent international move from Oregon to Montreal. I didn't feel a sense of relief when I stepped off the plane into the usually packed Pierre Trudeau International Airport, now eerily silent because of the restrictions the Canadian government had placed on non-essential travel from abroad. I assumed that I would feel relieved, maybe even happy, and instead I felt unsettled. So this presentation is some of the introductory chapter of a book I'm working on about the peculiar nuances of racism in Canada and the US and the power of freedom dreams that link and inspire Black people across the national borders. I offer insights from the perspective of someone who has deep ties and deep loyalties to and critiques of both countries. I am not unlike those who came before me. For my ancestors, Canada was the promised land. It was a refuge from American slavery, a chance to access the rights of citizenship, to make lives for themselves and their children, to start anew as recognized members of a political community. For me, the United States was the birthplace of the struggle against racism, the geographic core of Black cultural identity, and the originator of a blood debt owed to my kin for generations of bondage. But some truths only reveal themselves while we're moving from one place to the next. And 150 years apart, my ancestors and I gained parallel views as inside outsiders in both countries. Those who have claims to belonging in political or even moral terms, but whose memberships in the communities we seek to become part of is always troubled, always incomplete. Before I moved to Boston in the summer of 2010, I had a conversation with my dissertation advisor, who is an American originally from Chicago. She's been living in Toronto for decades. I told her that I was excited to go to the US, in part to put my money where my mouth was. I had been arguing for years that there was racism and racial inequality in Canada, just like there was in the US. And for years, I had been told that I was wrong. I was told that I was wrong so often and that there was nothing political about race and that I was in the wrong discipline that I wrote an article on the subject. So I would have something to show the mediocre white boys in my PhD program who told me that if I really wanted to know about race, I should just watch The Wire. After I told this to my advisor, the brilliant Jennifer Nadelsky, She paused for a moment and said that one of the things that she thought was most compelling about my work was that I saw race politics differently than American academics. She said that my work turned a lot of her American-born and bred assumptions about race and racism upside down, that what she valued about my research was the way that it asks not just why things are the way they are, but whether they have to be that way at all. I hope you always retain the sense that things are odd, she said as we parted ways. This, unfortunately, is my only talent. I see invisible things, things that others don't notice, things that don't strike anyone else as being out of place, things that are always more contradictory and more complicated than they seem at first glance. Cornelius Thompson wasn't a nice man, my dad once warned. All he knew was the violence he experienced, and he brought that violence back upon his wife and children. And he lived to be 95. 95, Deborah. Even God didn't want him. Americans often think of their country as exceptional. It's one of the world's oldest democracies, the birthplace of revolutionary freedom, the only remaining superpower, the last line of defense in a world constantly threatened by dictators and demagogues. Most famously articulated in 1835 by the French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville in the 2-volume study, Democracy in America, the concept of American exceptionalism suggests that the tenacity of America's democratic ideals is unusual, extraordinary, or unparalleled. There's something dramatic, or maybe it's just dramatically individualistic, about the primacy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It seems so much more daring than Canada's motto of peace, order, and good governance. But the doctrine of American exceptionalism requires a willful ignorance of how American democracy has worked for those who were excluded from the original 18th century formulation of we, the people. The self-evident truth of the liberal ideal that all men were created equal was scarred into the Declaration of Independence at the same time that nearly 20% of that population was held in bondage. The chasm that separates America's sacred ideals from its often sadistic racial practices is as old as the Constitution and just as deeply ingrained. In 1938, the Carnegie Corporation recruited Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal to lead a comprehensive study of the Negro in the United States. The report was called An American Dilemma, the Negro Problem and Modern Democracy. It was published in 1944, and it was a path-breaking work of social science. Myrdal argued that white Americans lived with a fundamental moral dilemma. On one hand, they believed wholeheartedly in what he called the American creed, principles of individualism, democracy, and egalitarianism. On the other hand, Black Americans lived with the realities of racism and segregation. On the whole, Myrdal offered a hopeful view of the Negro problem, suggesting that in the moral conflict between the American creed and enduring racial discrimination, democratic values would eventually win the day. But how does it feel to be a problem? Not just any ordinary problem, but the Negro problem. How does it feel when the problem that they speak of is your very existence? In the opening pages of The Souls of Black Folk, published long before Myrdal knew of America's dilemma, the prolific African-American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois identified this as the unasked question of white America. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, he writes, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? They say, I know an excellent colored man in my town, or I fought at Mechanicsville, or do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. I found myself thinking about this question when I first moved to the United States, riding the Red Line to Harvard Station. I watched young Black men get on the subway, laughing and joking like teenagers always do. I watched as the white people in the vicinity surreptitiously moved away and avoided eye contact with them. How does it feel to be a problem? I thought of this question when I moved to start my first teaching position at Ohio University, located in a college town nestled in the foothills of Appalachia. I was running along the Hocking River path when a pickup truck zoomed by and a man's voice screamed, "Hey, nigger!" It wasn't the first or the last time that something like this happened, but the worst was yet to come, and it came from my white colleagues, so desperate to be seen as progressive and tolerant to my face, but resentful and vindictive behind my back. Deb Thompson, they told my dean, she's so full of herself, like a bull in a china shop, not very collegial. How does it feel to be a problem? Maybe I'm not the one who's the problem here. Du Bois knew all this and more. He coined the phrase double consciousness to describe the two-ness of being African-American and American at the same time. A conflict not of loyalty and not of allegiance, but one characterized by the hard truth that the core ideas of American national identity, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, were only made possible to white Americans because of the torturous and deadly subjugation of Black Americans. Double consciousness is also a description of the psychic weight of constantly viewing one's own Black identity, experiences, behavior, and potential through the eyes of white people that likely hate you. It is an utterly exhausting tactic of Black survival, defined by the liminal necessity of being simultaneously internally and externally oriented, neither here nor there, yet nowhere and everywhere at the same time. From the vantage point of African Americans, the United States isn't exceptionally free, and it isn't exceptionally equal. American racism is all the more tragic, more cunning, more ruinous, precisely because it exists in direct contradiction, but alongside the American dream. And to those who observe American history from abroad, the United States is exceptional only in terms of how utterly, unforgivably, uncompromisingly racist it is. The idea of American racial exceptionalism is particularly powerful in Canada. American racism is understood as real and morally repulsive, and in comparative terms, Canadian racism either does not exist, or if it does, it is perceived to be less harmful, less depraved, less entrenched, and less traumatic than the racism in the United States. Comparison is routinely, frequently, and faithfully used in the service of Canadian deniability. It is a national pastime, an obsession that works to simultaneously hide and entrench persistent racial inequalities that define nearly every socioeconomic indicator of Canadian life. The cognitive dissonance required to be righteously indignant about anti-Black racism in America, but defensive when the perpetrators are the us and not the them, is itself a peculiarly Canadian form of racism. I know that some might think that the racism that exists in Canada, in my opinion, more insidious, harder to name and therefore challenge, always operating under the cloud of plausible deniability, that this racism is somehow better than the in-your-face racism of the United States. But I lived through both, and I'd rather face the enemy that can at least be named than the ones that Canadians deny even exists. Between 2010 and 2020, I lived in 4 very different parts of the United States, each with a complicated history of racism. My initiation to American life was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the outskirts of Boston, the birthplace of American freedom. Next, I lived 4 long, hard years in Athens, Ohio, a small white college town in one of the poorest counties in the state. In 2015, I moved to Chicago, the great Black metropolis, where the legacies of Emmett Till, Fred Hampton, and Michelle Obama collide. My last years in the US were spent in Oregon, founded as a white ethno-state, where the clash between the frontier and the coast mimicked the disparate ideological forces at play in state politics. I have lived in more places in America than most Americans. The places that I've called home have all been north of the Mason-Dixon line. Beyond the 3-day academic conferences held in Atlanta or Houston, I actually haven't spent much time in the South at all. It's interesting that people from the North tend to associate racism only with the South. It reminds me of the way Canadians talk about the United States. Racism happened a long time ago or somewhere else. But many African-American cultural traditions were curated in the South and brought to the far reaches of the country during the Great Migration, when Southern Blacks fled north and west to escape the economic ruin of the Great Depression and the terror of white lynch mobs. My claims to Blackness were frequently betrayed by my total ignorance of many geographically attuned norms. Before moving to the US, I had never eaten grits, and I didn't know why it mattered if they were savory or sweet. It matters, apparently, a lot. But whenever I felt left out, Black people, total strangers sometimes, would embrace me as one of their own. There are guardians, of course, that patrol the boundaries of Blackness. Much like gender, there's a performative element to racial identity, and I just lacked the knowledge to perform a soliloquy when circumstances demanded it. But Black Americans accepted, understood, and were even kind of amused by my Canadian Blackness. There are Black people in Canada, they'd say. This was before Drake hit it big, when Canadians still thought of him as Jimmy on Degrassi High. I eventually came to understand this generosity of Black Americans as itself a form of resistance. The idea of the African diaspora refers to the ways that African descended peoples around the globe are connected through our common sense of identity, history, folklore, imagined homeland, cultural symbols, experiences of subjugation, and political commitments. Even, I'm sorry, there's a floor cleaner behind me. It's very distracting. Even as there are specific Black experiences in the United States, a larger diasporic sense of Black identity emerges from the various attempts of Black people to find peace, safety, and redemption in the face of relentless global white supremacy, and the transnational circulation of ideas and activists as they engage in various but related struggles towards emancipation, self-determination, and autonomy. The act of moving across borders, forced and freedom-seeking, escape and exile, is central to the African diaspora. The scattering of African descended peoples in the Americas originates from the traumatic, violent, forced departure of the transatlantic slave trade. To be enslaved was to have your movements regulated, surveilled, and criminalized. Black history is full of forced relocations, mass population removals, displacements, segregated spaces, zoned existences, and escapes. But Black migration has also been done in defiance. Leaving America has sometimes been a strategy of Black liberation. Liberia and Sierra Leone were founded as colonies for Black people when many countries still traded in human lives. James Baldwin, Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, and Josephine Baker all left and found peace and humanity elsewhere, even when it was temporary. Exile has, at times, been emancipatory. Of course, the ability to move across the border is an incredible privilege. My teenage self is in awe of how much time I used to spend on airplanes. I didn't set foot on an international flight until my early 20s. I never fathomed I would have a life that required a passport. But it's not the passport that gives you the ability to travel, it's your membership in the political community, what your passport represents, your citizenship. My brother used to work for years as an immigration agent for the Canadian Border Security Agency at Toronto's Pearson Airport. And before I went anywhere, he would always say, remember, as a Canadian citizen, you can't be denied entry to Canada. They have to let you come home. The idea of return has a special meaning for we, the scattered descendants of those who survived the Middle Passage. So too, Pan-Africanism, Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line, and the Back to Africa movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries are fleeting examples of a frequently idealized dream that African descended peoples around the world might one day go back to the birthplace of our ancestors. The idea of return, though, can only ever be an educated guess. The benightedness is part of the longing and the fascination. In the wonderful book, Lose Your Mother, Saidiya Hartman grapples with these questions as she retraces the roots of captives from Ghana's hinterlands to the coast. She writes, "The country in which you disembark is never the country of which you have dreamed. The disappointment was inevitable. What place in the world could sate 400 years of yearning for a home?" The meaning of home, one of the questions I'm trying to think through, is full of these tensions, complications, and contradictions. There are no easy answers. Our understandings of home frequently clash with the rigid boundaries and bindings of citizenship regimes as immigrants, refugees, exiles, diasporic groups, and those who are stateless or nationless change the meaning of membership in a political community through their access to it or lack thereof. Home is a particular place and moment, even as our conceptions of it transcend both time and space. Home encompasses desire and nostalgia. It brings together memories and longings, our future children and our ancestors long gone, democratic processes of conflict and consensus, the local, the global, inclusion and exclusion, the corporal and the intangible, the material and the ghostly. The very idea of return implies that we can go back to a place where we once were, but no longer are, and yet desire to be. Paradoxically, mobility and constraint exist in tandem. It's entirely possible to be homeward bound and yet bound by home. But as the saying goes, what if we can't really go home again? Home is a calling for many, but my understanding of home is rife with ambiguity. The book I'm writing is an attempt to articulate some of the story of what it was like to live in the United States, the land of my ancestors, a country that is and isn't mine, to be doubly unwanted as an immigrant and a Black person, but there by choice and protected by incredible class privilege. And now, at a moment when Black uprisings have once again called the meaning of American democracy into question, to leave to return to Canada. I want to provide a lens into the unrepentant structural racism of American society while not negating the subversive, insidious racism of Canada. To share my bewilderment and awe at African Americans' love and hope and pride in their country, their dedication to making it better, even as it has, more often than not, refused to love them back. I seek to articulate how, even as I return to Canada, the country of my birth, a nation that prides itself on multiculturalism, a place that sells the mythology of the promised land and the imagery of racial diversity, I still feel as though my acceptance into the Canadian mosaic is conditional. But much like Dorothy's quest to find the Wizard of Oz or Alice's trip down the rabbit hole to Wonderland, you first have to leave home to know where and what it really is. More than anything, this is a story, I think, about what it means to be in a place, to have ancestral ties to a place, but to be not of that place. These are questions that I've asked myself for a decade as I try to think through whether I can and should lay claim to America, whether I can and should lay claim to Canada, whether I can and should lay claim to Black freedom dreams that might have been born in the United States, but which have also traveled around the world, whether Canada and Canadians will welcome me home, and what these claims might mean in the broader context of what it means to truly belong to and in the African diaspora. That's all I have. Thank you.
Deb, thank you. That was a tremendous, and I know I speak for everybody who's had the opportunity to listen, tremendous tour de force. And I can say, to the extent that there is any certainty in this world, that your book is going to be a bestseller.
Oh, I hope so.
No, it is, because frankly, what you have to say is tremendously important, and it crosses every kind of territorial, human, border that there may be. It's just wonderful. Thank you. We have a series of questions, and I'm just going to throw some out to you as we go along here. And we have a bunch of them, so we'll try and fit them all in the next 15 or 20 minutes. It's clear that you've persuasively and correctly point out that there is a need to constantly challenge and, in fact, debunk what you call linear narratives of racial progress.
Mm-hmm.
How do we explain the fact that, how do we explain the persistence that these linear narratives continue to be out there?
Yeah, I mean, so the linear narratives of racial progress are to a certain extent built into liberalism, right? They're, you know, liberalism is premised on egalitarianism, on individualism, on universalism, and on the idea of progress, or as Canadians would say, progress, right? And so like the idea that we're moving from the explicit racism of the past to a post-racial future, you know, not only does it align really well with a lot of our ideas of liberalism, but, you know, like, it's a happy story. Like, we love happy endings. Like, you know, we like it when the good guy wins. And so the idea that, like, we might just be like a society defined by racism for the rest of humanity's existence is like, that doesn't feel good. That doesn't, you know, that doesn't sound, and it also contradicts, I think, a lot of the ways that we view ourselves, right? A lot of the ways that we like to view our family and our friends, our colleagues, our fellow, you know, Canadians and Americans. Like, we would like to believe that as a society, we can overcome this. This is just an aberration of democracy. This isn't who we are. And, you know, my take is, I think that, you know, it will be very, very hard to dismantle white supremacy, in part because of the way that it's entrenched in various institutions. But we certainly can't face what we deny exists. And that's part of the problem. We want to move so quickly to the post-racial society without doing any of the work that's necessary to dismantle the society we currently have.
Well put, well put. Another inquiry came in. You made the observation that for most Canadians looking south of the border and they see the United States as a profoundly racist society, and then when they consider their own neighborhoods, so to speak, to many Canadians, race is not an issue, or to the extent that racism in Canada exists, it exists in a considerably more mild form. I think most people would still suggest today, in fact, if you pick up Canada's national newspaper, the Globe and Mail today, it's all over the front cover and everywhere else, that the principal source of societal cleavage in Canada is Indigenous peoples, Indigenous issues. And you know, whereas in the United States, it may be more explicitly defined simply as race. It's a challenge, I think, for Emma. I'd appreciate your comments to this inquiry about, you know, sort of competing points of cleavage in Canada for attention and things. Thank you.
That's so interesting because, you know, if this conversation was happening 10 years ago, I think that the unanimous conclusion, maybe not unanimous, but would be either that the dominant cleavage in Canadian society is linguistic or regional, right? Like, this was certainly what my professors told me when I was taking Canadian politics courses at the University of Toronto, that, like, those were the real cleavages in Canadian society, not race, and certainly not Indigenous peoples. But I think that discourse has changed while I was gone, happily so, because, for any socioeconomic indicator, of course, in Canadian society, Indigenous people are horribly disadvantaged. And I think that, like, the intersection of anti-Black racism and settler colonialism is really interesting. And I'm thinking more about that kind of for the book, because, like, settler colonialism is not reducible to racism, right? They're different, right? In part because settler colonialism involves the theft of Indigenous lands and the eradication of Indigenous cultures. And, anti-Black racism was based on the free or and exploited labor of Black people, right? So Patrick Wolf has a great article on this. So they're fundamentally different even as they're intersecting. And I'm wary of efforts to ever kind of like pit, like to pit those groups against each other. Even as, frequently there's someone on Twitter that no matter what I publish in the Globe and Mail, like just is like, whatever, like settler bullshit, which is fine, which is fine in a lot of ways. Although the literature has not conclusively determined whether or not we should consider Black people settlers. Like that's a whole body of literature that we don't have time to get into. Anyways, this is to say that I think that the dominant narratives of Canada, like are the stuff that myths are made of. And it's really hard to get Canadians to acknowledge the reality of racism given kind of the mythological status of multiculturalism.
That's a very good point. It's a very good point. One inquiry that just came in was to ask, what should Americans, especially U.S. university students who are joining us today, know about the history and the current experience of being Black in Canada?
All right. Okay, so there's a lot to know. I can recommend a couple of good books really quickly. Robin Maynard's Policing Black Lives is an excellent literature review of kind of all the work on Black Canada that's been done from slavery to the present. Things that I would like American and Canadians to know about Blackness in Canada. Like number one, there was slavery in Canada. It lasted until 1833 when slavery was eradicated throughout the entire British Empire. And in fact, the Underground Railroad, which Canadians celebrate so frequently, was originally conceived to smuggle slaves out of Canada into the free northern states, which abolished slavery well before Canada did. So, if we want to myth bust in Canada about the presence of Black people and about the status of Black people throughout Canadian history, there's a lot to be said. Robin Maynard covers quite a bit of it in her book. Also the work of course, Barrington Walker and other historians have done a great job uncovering some of that. The other thing I would mention is that, the Canadian Black population has always been kind of small to be, right? And it's small in part because like Canada had a white-only immigration policy for 70 years, and explicitly prohibited Black immigration in an order in council in 1911, right? So it wasn't until Canada replaced the immigration policy with a more neutral system in the late 1960s that immigration from non-European source countries started to change the demographics of the country. But the Black population of Canada is still really, really small. It's only at like between 3.5% and 4% of the entire Canadian population. American students frequently don't know how small the Canadian population is. So we're talking about, the Canadian population is like 36 million people, right? It's like less people than California. So this is to say that like the kind of dynamics you have in the US where African Americans have been like 12, 13% of the population for most of American history, like that significant like group of people, just like, it's just much harder to get traction on these issues in Canada, especially before the 1980s and 90s when the populations were tiny.
Right. Next question we have for you to consider is one of our astute participants today pointed out the fact that when you look at the Black community in the United States, they are by no means monolithic.
Yeah.
There are clear tensions within the Black community and be measured in various ways. The question is, what type of tensions, what are the principal tensions that exist within the Black community in Canada?
Such a great question. So one of, there are two that I'm going to talk about. One is that there are three distinct waves of Black immigration to Canada. The first were the Loyalists, and those were, African, I don't know, America wasn't a country at the time. So those were Black people who fought for Great Britain during the American Revolution. And after Britain lost, were like fled to Canada. So there are about 3,000 Black Loyalists who came to Canada, mostly settled in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick a little bit. And that's like a longstanding historic Black community. Some Loyalists also brought their enslaved people with them, the people that they had enslaved to Canada, because of course slavery was still legal in Canada at that point. So there's a long-standing historic population there. The second wave of Black immigration were the refugees, and these are the people who escaped slavery in the U.S. and fled through the Underground Railroad to Canada. They lived primarily in the southwestern Ontario. That's where I'm descended from. And the third group, the third wave of immigration is this newer group, and most populous by far, right? Who largely come from the Caribbean, and now more and more people are coming from Africa. And they're the newest group because, of course, the point system was only changed in the late 60s. So the dynamics of the Black experience in Canada are such that like those three waves don't necessarily get along, have different understandings of what it means to be Black, have different cultural origins in terms of how they understand Blackness, and kind of have different relationships both to Canada and to Canada's British heritage, which is an interesting kind of idea. The second thing to know about Blackness in Canada is that it's always formed relationally. I was talking with Ronaldo Walcott recently, and he made an argument about like this diasporic identity that was much closer to like what is experienced in Britain, like the Black British diaspora. It's kind of amalgam of cultures, and where the influence of the Caribbean is very clear. But I also think that the influence of the U.S. it just looms so large. In part, just like it's really hard to share a continent with like a cultural hegemon. Right? Like we get American TV, we get American commercials, we worship, the same kind of like American folk heroes and athletes and singers, and right. So the ways in which Blackness is formulated in the US or has historically been formulated in the US has played a pretty big role in the formulation of Blackness in Canada. Robin Winks wrote the history of Black people in Canada in a book called Blacks in Canada. And he argued that, there was never any there's no Canadian Martin Luther King. And what he misses is that Canadians didn't need a Canadian Martin Luther King because we had the American Martin Luther King, right? Like CBC was broadcasting Martin Luther King's speeches even after American networks had banned him for some of his stances against the Vietnam War, right? And so these cultural influences are really important, and they influence Black identity in interesting ways.
Following on a remark you made a moment ago, we have an inquiry just wondering, for Black individuals who come to Canada who are associated with either former British or French colonies, is their introduction and integration, if you will, into Canadian society different for Blacks who don't come from, say, a British or French colonial experience?
That is really interesting. I haven't seen any data on that. I know that the integration of French-speaking like Black immigrants into Quebec is like a very interesting subject that we should talk about at length, in part because Quebec, of course, is this distinct society within Canada, in part because Quebec is like, as a society, is like not great at recognizing racism. And in fact, like the current premier has said point blank that systemic racism does not exist. And so, even as that's true, we still see like significant empirical data that indicates that Black immigrants in Quebec are significantly disadvantaged along a host of socioeconomic indicators. So that's interesting. In terms of British, like immigrants, Black immigrants from like British colonies, I know that like the Jamaican influence in Toronto is like very, very interesting. And in part because like they, there is that colonial legacy that Jamaica, of course, has in common with Canada. An interesting, very quick story is that before Canada counted by race on its census, in 1986, the question was on ethnic origin, and the bureaucracy would like use these proxy indicators to figure out people's race, but it was a really inaccurate method, in part because, you know, when given the choice of like British or French, Jamaicans were identifying as British and Haitians were identifying as French. And so like the Black counts, the counts of like the Black population were being reduced because these people were identifying in a way that like they felt was accurate to their ethnic origin, but that also made counting like visible minorities much more challenging. Anyway, these are all very interesting questions, and I wish I had more time to answer them.
I'm going to leave you with one more for today, if you don't mind. It's a big one. Canada's policy, longstanding policies focused on multiculturalism, or what we may call interculturalism today. To what extent can they be considered to be counterproductive to recognizing and addressing systemic racism in Canada?
Sure. That is the question, right?
Thank you.
That is the question. So if you look at Canada's multiculturalism policy, it's like very, very light on any kind of mechanism to address racism, period. Not even systemic racism, just like someone calling you the N-word on the street, right? Like the multiculturalism policy is not going to help you with that. The Multiculturalism Act doesn't necessarily help with that. What it does do is provide a lot of money, or some money, it's actually a minuscule amount, for like multicultural festivals and folklore, right? So the multiculturalism policy was never as big and bad as either its proponents or critics kind of made it out to be. How it was powerful is in creating this national ethic, right? This national ideal of multiculturalism, or this national image of Canada as a multicultural society. And that image, I think, has been really instrumental in preventing Canadians from believing that systemic racism exists, or even understanding systemic racism as a concept. You know, like whenever I talk to Canadians about racism, like inevitably somebody says like, but it's Canada, we're so multicultural. And the response I say is like, have you been to the United States, right? Like the US is multicultural too. Like I lived in an incredibly diverse neighborhood in Chicago. Like there are cities in the US that are like more diverse than Toronto or Montreal, frankly, right? Well, actually, I don't know if that's true, but like, you know, like there's lots of diversity. There's lots of multiculturalism as we think of it in Canada, that exists in the US as well. And like racism's rampant in the US, right? So multiculturalism doesn't perform the kind of shielding effects that Canadians think it does. And if you look at the policy, it's got no teeth. It was never intended to, is part of the other story, right? Like the multiculturalism policy was not the policy, but like, you know, when Trudeau announced the policy in 1971, like the Black population of Canada was like 0.2%. It was less than 1% of the population was Black, right? Like less than 2% of the population was visible minority or Indigenous. Like it's just like the multiculturalism policy was not designed for people of color. It was designed for like white ethnic groups. And it was designed to prevent Francophone Canadians from galvanizing the sovereignty movement, the sovereigntist movement.
You know, it's we thank you so very much for joining us today. I think everybody wants to give you a big clap and a high five. You know, it's terrifically sad in some respects that we still need in 2021 to convene a wonderful discussion where race remains front and center. It's just horrific that we need to do that, but we do need to do that, because if we don't do it, there won't be any, and I'll use the great Canadian pronunciation, which I didn't know until today, I learned something new, is progress. No self-respecting Canadian would use the word progress, but anyway, we'll go with progress. So thank you. I'll go home and use that one tonight on the family. So I'll turn it over to Amy, please.
At this time, we ask for audience feedback on this session via the Zoom poll being presented on your screen. Thank you, Deborah and Chris, for this important conversation. And special thanks to all our virtual audience participants and to our supporters at SUNY Plattsburgh, the U.S. Department of Education and the Quebec Ministry of International Relations and La Francophonie. If you are interested to review our previous Conversations on Canada sessions, please visit the links that I'm posting in the chat right now. As a reminder, Dr. Christopher Kirky discussed in September why Donald Trump is mad at Canada, understanding American foreign policy toward Canada. And in October, Mr. Andre Picard, award-winning Canadian journalist and author specializing in healthcare issues, spoke on the pandemic experience. How do Canada and the US compare? We look forward to contacting you with an invitation to join us for more sessions of the Conversations on Canada series. And until then, may you be safe, healthy, and surrounded by all good things. Thank you again for joining us today.